The objects we often overlook: a fastener on a coat, a decoration on a garment, hold within them surprisingly rich histories. This is particularly true of buttons. For centuries they've served as both functional closures and striking emblems, yet their story remains largely untold, overshadowed by narratives focused on grander inventions or more celebrated crafts. Initially, buttons weren't about fastening at all. They emerged in Europe during the medieval period primarily as decorative elements adorning luxurious clothing. These early examples were often crafted from precious materials like gold, silver, enamel, and gemstones, a testament to their status as ornamental objects rather than practical fasteners. The wealthiest members of society displayed them prominently, using buttons to signal rank and affluence. As time progressed, the function of buttons began to evolve. They started appearing on a wider range of clothing, though still largely confined to those who could afford them. The shift toward widespread button use coincided with significant technological advancements beginning in the 18th century. Prior to this period, garments were frequently secured using laces, pins, or hooks, and eyes methods that proved cumbersome and restrictive. The Industrial Revolution brought about new manufacturing processes, which allowed for buttons to be produced more quickly and cheaply, making them accessible to a broader population. This marked a pivotal moment in the history of buttons. They transitioned from symbols of elite status to essential components of everyday attire. The increasing availability of buttons spurred innovation in their design and manufacture. Early industrial techniques involved hand-carving buttons from materials like bone, horn, or wood, but these methods proved slow and labor-intensive. The introduction of machinery, particularly molds and stamping presses, significantly accelerated production and reduced costs. By the mid-19th century, factories began to appear in Europe and America, churning out buttons at an unprecedented rate. These factories employed both men and women, often under challenging working conditions, contributing to a burgeoning textile industry workforce. The materials used also expanded beyond precious metals and jewels. Cheaper alternatives such as glass, shell, tin, and later plastics became commonplace. This diversification broadened the appeal of buttoned clothing, allowing for greater stylistic variation and affordability across social classes. Catalogs began circulating, showcasing an ever-expanding array of designs from simple discs to elaborate molded shapes, catering to diverse tastes and fashion trends. These catalogs, like those produced by Button Creations and Adams and Albert, served as vital marketing tools, connecting manufacturers with retailers and consumers alike. The proliferation of button catalogs, like those from Button Creations and Adams and Albert, reflected a broader shift within the industry itself. While large factories dominated production, smaller workshops persisted, often specializing in particular styles or materials. These artisans catered to niche markets, producing buttons for uniforms, bespoke clothing, or specialized crafts. The National Button Society, founded in 1942, further fostered this appreciation for button collecting and historical preservation, providing a forum for enthusiasts to exchange information and showcase rare specimens. Publications like Button Parade, edited by Dorothy Foster Brown, documented these collections and celebrated the artistry of button design. These catalogs and societies reveal an increasing awareness among consumers and collectors regarding buttons' aesthetic qualities and their potential as historical artifacts. The history of fastening clothing is long and varied, with early methods including laces, brooches, and clasps. The button itself, as we understand it, a distinct object used to secure garments, appears surprisingly late in that timeline. While buttons evolved over centuries into the functional closures we recognize today, their earliest iterations were often decorative rather than practical. Among the most intriguing of these early examples originate from the Indus Valley Civilization, flourishing between approximately 3300 and 1700 BCE. Archaeological evidence reveals numerous disc-shaped objects discovered at sites like Mohenjo-Daro and Chandhu-Daro. These artifacts, typically crafted from shell, are undeniably button-like in form, small circular discs with a central perforation. However, their function remains ambiguous. They were not generally used to fasten clothing. Instead, these Indus Valley buttons appear as ornamental elements sewn onto garments, likely for aesthetic appeal rather than closure. The shells themselves would have been carefully selected and worked, suggesting an appreciation for beauty and craftsmanship. The decorative nature of these early buttons highlights a significant distinction from later iterations that prioritized functionality. They represent a period where adornment was paramount, and the act of fastening clothing served as another opportunity to display status or personal style. The materials used, primarily shell, indicate access to coastal resources and potentially established trade networks for acquiring suitable specimens. These objects offer a glimpse into the cultural values of the Indus Valley people, demonstrating an early interest in decorative detail and perhaps even symbolic representation through small-scale ornamentation. The prevalence of shell buttons across Indus Valley sites suggests their significance extended beyond mere personal adornment, potentially playing a role in broader cultural practices and trade networks. While the precise methods of shell acquisition remain unclear, the consistent use of specific types of shells implies established routes for procurement. The discovery of these artifacts at both Mohenjo-Daro and Chandhu-Daro indicates a widespread distribution within the Indus Valley civilization, suggesting a degree of standardization in their production or exchange. Britannica notes that buttons were frequently used as indicators of wealth and rank. While direct comparisons across civilizations are fraught with difficulty, it is plausible that these shell discs served similar functions within Indus Valley society, signifying status or affiliation through access to valued materials and skilled craftsmanship. The uniformity observed in the button's form, the circular shape and central perforation further supports the possibility of organized production and distribution rather than purely individual creation. The utilization of shell for button production would see significant expansions centuries later, particularly with industrial mechanization. Britannica notes that by the late 19th century, manufacturers increasingly employed nitric acid to separate shell layers and tubular saws to cut blanks, facilitating mass production. Initially, only deep-sea shells were utilized. However, American producers like John F. Bhopal subsequently incorporated freshwater mussel shells from the Mississippi River system, broadening the resource base for button manufacture. The earliest known precursors to buttons appear in ancient Egypt and Rome, though their function differed significantly from the fasteners we recognize today. These objects were initially decorative elements, adorning garments and accessories, rather than serving a practical purpose of closure. Evidence suggests that Egyptians utilized circular discs made from materials like stone, shell, and precious metals as ornamental embellishments. Similarly, Romans incorporated such discs into jewelry and clothing designs. These early buttons weren't sewn through buttonholes. Instead, they were likely stitched directly onto fabric or attached with pins. Britannica notes that purely decorative, non-utilitarian buttons have frequently been used on clothing. The materials employed stone, shell, precious metals, immediately signified the wearer's status and wealth. While the precise symbolic meanings embedded in these objects remain open to interpretation, their presence on ceremonial robes and jewelry suggests a connection to religious or ritualistic practices. The Roman adoption of similar decorative discs further underscores this trend. Like their Egyptian counterparts, Romans used these circular forms as embellishments rather than fasteners. The materials gold, silver, ivory, copper alloys were indicative of wealth and rank. Metalsmiths frequently embellished such buttons with insets of ivory, tortoiseshell, and jewels. This practice highlights the value placed on visual display and social differentiation within Roman society. It's important to note that at this stage, garments were fastened using methods other than buttons, clasps or brooches being more common, and the button's role was purely ornamental. The practice of adorning garments with these discs continued into later Roman periods. Britannica notes that by the 14th century, buttons were worn as both ornaments and fastenings extending from the elbow to the wrist and neckline to the waist. While primarily decorative, their increasing prevalence suggests a gradual shift in function, though true buttonholes remained absent. The materials used, gold, silver, ivory, copper alloys, remained potent indicators of social standing. Wearing gold or silver buttons signaled considerable wealth. Metalsmiths continued embellishing these objects with insets of ivory, tortoiseshell, and jewels, further amplifying their visual impact and reinforcing hierarchical distinctions within Roman society. Britannica also mentions that buttons made from more affordable materials like bone or wood served as foundations for fabric-covered buttons, indicating a broadening adoption of the decorative element across different social strata, even if the base material was less valuable. The prevalence of these decorative discs also intersected with Roman sumptuary laws, regulations restricting expenditure on clothing and adornment based on social class. Britannica notes that such legislation limited the use of gold, silver, and ivory buttons to individuals of a certain rank, further reinforcing their role as markers of status. While crafted from more affordable materials like bone or wood, these served as foundations for fabric-covered buttons, broadening adoption across different strata, even if the base material was less valuable. The practice demonstrates an evolving aesthetic preference alongside existing social hierarchies. The decorative buttons previously discussed, those adorned with fabric or precious materials, lacked a crucial element: functionality. They were purely ornamental, affixed to clothing for display rather than closure. This changed in the 13th century within German lands. Prior to this innovation, garments fastened using methods like pins, ties, or elaborate lacing systems. The introduction of the buttonhole fundamentally altered the role of buttons, transforming them from mere embellishments into practical fasteners. The precise origin of the buttonhole remains elusive. However, its emergence coincided with increasing popularity and refinement in button design during this period. Early examples involved simple slits, cut directly into fabric to accommodate a button's shank, the small post extending from the back of the button. These shanks were often integral parts of the button itself, molded as one piece with the decorative front. This allowed for a secure attachment when the cloth was drawn closed. The earliest evidence suggests that these buttonholes were relatively crude and likely hand-sewn, reflecting the labor-intensive nature of early garment construction. The adoption of this new fastening method wasn't immediate or universal. It gradually spread alongside advancements in tailoring techniques and a growing demand for more secure and convenient clothing closures. The ability to quickly fasten and unfasten garments with buttons and buttonholes offered practical advantages, particularly for those engaged in physical labor or travel. Initially, these designs were simple. This innovation marked a significant shift in how people interacted with their clothing, moving beyond purely decorative elements towards functional utility. The relatively simple construction of these early buttonholes also presented challenges for garment makers. While offering a secure closure, the slits weakened the fabric along the edges, making them prone to tearing and fraying with repeated use and washing. This necessitated careful stitching and reinforcement, adding further labor to the clothing production process. The durability of the attachment remained a concern. Buttons could still become detached if subjected to significant stress or rough handling. Despite these limitations, the buttonhole represented a substantial improvement over previous fastening methods like pins or ties, which were either cumbersome or unreliable. Early attempts at strengthening the fabric around the holes involved layering multiple pieces of cloth and employing more intricate stitching patterns, techniques that would become increasingly standardized as tailoring practices evolved. Furthermore, experimentation with different materials for both buttons and fabrics likely influenced the success rate of these early buttonhole closures. Coarser textiles proved less amenable to this new fastening system than finer weaves. The process of creating them often resulted in uneven closures, with some buttons sitting higher or lower along a garment's front. This inconsistency was particularly noticeable on finer fabrics, where even slight variations became apparent. The labor involved in achieving even buttonhole alignment further increased production time and costs. Furthermore, the limited availability of skilled tailors capable of executing precise buttonhole stitching meant that this new fastening method remained largely confined to higher-end garments initially. Prior to the 13th century, garments in medieval Europe were secured using methods like lacing, brooches, clasps, or points. The introduction of buttonholes during that period marked a significant shift, leading to buttons becoming increasingly prominent features on clothing. Their adoption wasn't merely functional. It quickly evolved into a visible indicator of social standing and wealth. By the 14th century, buttons began appearing not only as fasteners, but also as decorative elements, adorning garments from the wrist to the neckline and across the chest. The materials used in button construction directly reflected an individual's status. Those demonstrating considerable affluence frequently chose gold, silver, or ivory for their buttons. Copper alloys were utilized for more expensive options, often embellished with insets of ivory, tortoiseshell, or jewels. While bone and wood served as common alternatives, they represented a lower tier within the button hierarchy. Thread was sometimes wrapped around wire rings to create buttons, another variation on available materials. The conspicuous display of valuable buttons, gold, silver, and ivory, became an overt signifier of rank and wealth within medieval society. This trend didn't go unnoticed by civic authorities. In certain cities, sumptuary laws were enacted to regulate button usage, effectively restricting their application based on social class. These regulations aimed to maintain a visual distinction between the elite and common populace through controlled displays of material possessions. The sumptuary laws varied considerably from city to city and over time. In some instances, they dictated that only individuals holding specific offices or belonging to particular guilds could wear buttons made of gold. Others restricted silver buttons to those of a certain rank within the nobility. The use of ivory was similarly controlled, often reserved for members of royal households or high-ranking clergy. These legal limitations were not always strictly enforced, and attempts to circumvent them likely occurred, but they nonetheless demonstrate the significance attached to button ownership as an indicator of social position. Copper alloy buttons, while less expensive than precious metals, still signaled a degree of prosperity when embellished with ivory, tortoise shell, or jewels. Their presence denoted someone above the lower classes who could afford such adornments. The prevalence of bone and wood suggested a more modest economic standing, though even these materials could be fashioned into attractive designs. Thread-wrapped wire rings offered an economical alternative, further illustrating the range of button availability across different social strata. The materials used for these status symbols also reflected broader trends in trade and resource availability. Ivory, sourced from elephant tusks, necessitated long-distance commerce networks connecting Europe with Africa and Asia. Similarly, gemstones incorporated into button designs signaled access to lucrative trading routes and significant capital reserves. Even the copper alloys employed were not uniformly available. Their quality and composition varied depending on mining locations and metallurgical expertise. The embellishment of these buttons with ivory, tortoiseshell, or jewels further amplified their value as conspicuous displays of wealth, while thread-wrapped wire rings provided a more economical fastening solution for those with limited means. The very existence of such alternatives underscored the hierarchical nature of medieval society and its visual markers. Prior to the 13th century, medieval garments were secured using methods like lacing or fastening with brooches and clasps. The introduction of buttonholes marked a significant shift, rapidly elevating buttons from mere ornamentation to functional closures. By the 14th century, their presence became widespread. They adorned sleeves extending from elbow to wrist and ran down necklines to waists. This proliferation wasn't arbitrary. The materials used in button construction served as clear indicators of social standing. Gold, silver, and ivory were reserved for those of high rank and considerable wealth, while more accessible metals like copper and its alloys found their way into buttons. Even these were often embellished with precious additions. Metalsmiths frequently incorporated insets of ivory, tortoiseshell, or jewels to further signify status. A less costly alternative emerged through the creation of thread-wrapped wire rings, a practical fastening solution for those with more limited resources. This contrast highlighted the visual language of medieval society and its emphasis on hierarchical distinctions. The prevalence of buttons wasn't without regulation. In some regions, sumptuary laws were enacted to restrict their use based on social class. These legal limitations underscore the powerful symbolic role that buttons played in defining and reinforcing societal boundaries. The materials themselves spoke volumes about a person's position within the medieval order. The restriction of certain materials to specific social strata extended beyond mere display. It functioned as a visual reinforcement of established hierarchies. While gold and silver buttons signified nobility and immense wealth, even copper alloys, when embellished with ivory, tortoiseshell, or jewels, served to distinguish individuals from the lower classes. The creation of thread-wrapped wire rings provided a more economical fastening option for those lacking resources, further emphasizing this distinction. This practice was widespread. Bone and wood also furnished inexpensive materials for button construction, sometimes serving as bases upon which fabric could be applied. These less ostentatious buttons were common across various social levels, though the quality of workmanship would still reflect economic standing. The Britannica article notes that pewter, a familiar metal of the age, was disdained by wealthier individuals, reinforcing its association with lower socio-economic groups. Similarly, cast brass buttons, even those featuring ornamental designs, carried a similar connotation. The distinction extended to button placement as well. Wealthier individuals often adorned their garments with buttons concentrated on the front of a garment, while those of lesser means might place them along sleeves or down the back. The Britannica article notes that by the 14th century, buttons appeared worn as ornaments and fastenings from the elbow to the wrist and from the neckline to the waist. This proliferation in button usage signified an increasing aesthetic importance beyond mere functionality. While thread-wrapped wire rings offered a budget-friendly alternative, even these were subject to variations in quality, reflecting social standing. Finer threads and more elaborate wrapping techniques indicated greater resources. The availability of materials also influenced design. Bone or wood buttons might be carved into simple shapes, whereas those made from copper alloys allowed for more intricate molded forms. The increasing prominence of buttons throughout Europe spurred innovation in their manufacture. By the 14th century, wearing gold, silver, and ivory buttons signaled wealth and rank. Metalsmiths embellished these expensive buttons with materials like ivory, tortoiseshell, and jewels, while bone or wood served as more common foundations for buttons, particularly those covered in fabric. Copper alloys allowed for molded forms. The 18th century witnessed a shift. Luxury metals and ivory largely replaced fabrics, though embroidered buttons remained popular to complement specific garments. Pewter, prevalent at the time, was utilized for molded or stamped-out buttons, but was generally disdained by wealthier individuals. A notable development in button production occurred mid-18th century, with Matthew Boulton's introduction of cut steel buttons from England. These featured polished steel facets attached to a steel blank. In France, this technique was further refined through the incorporation of openwork designs into the facets. Simultaneously, brass buttons, particularly those made of calamine brass, became popular for both military and civilian dress, often adorned with ornamental patterns. French artisans began specializing in porcelain button manufacture during this period, distinguishing their output through hand-painted decorations or transfer printing using colored inks. The specialization of French artisans in porcelain button manufacture resulted in a distinctive product, often characterized by elaborate decoration. Hand painting allowed for individualized designs, while transfer printing offered a method for replicating patterns across multiple buttons using colored inks. This technique lowered production costs compared to entirely hand-painted pieces, making decorated porcelain buttons accessible to a wider clientele than purely bespoke examples. The Britannica article notes that Bohemia, now part of the Czech Republic, became a significant source of colored glass used in button manufacture during this period, suggesting some material sourcing occurred outside France itself. While the precise origins and workshops producing these French porcelain buttons remain sparsely documented, their presence signifies an increasing sophistication within the broader European button industry. The growing demand for embellishment extended beyond metalwork. Ceramic buttons joined cut steel and brass as sought-after decorative elements in fashionable attire. The Britannica article indicates that Japanese ceramic buttons, hand-painted with traditional motifs, also emerged during this period. Similarly, Chinese artisans developed buttons featuring intricately carved layers of vermilion lacquer applied to a wooden base, which gained popularity in Europe toward the late 19th century. European manufacturers produced decorated and lacquered papier-mâché buttons as well. The increasing mechanization of button production facilitated greater use of pearly shells from sea mollusks. These were separated into layers using nitric acid solutions before being cut with tubular saws and mechanically engraved. The rise of button use across Europe spurred innovation in materials and manufacturing techniques. While bone, wood, metal alloys like brass, and even fabric were employed, a significant contribution to this burgeoning industry came from Bohemia, now part of the Czech Republic. Britannica notes that Bohemia became particularly renowned for its production of colored glass used in button manufacture. The appeal of glass buttons lay in their potential for vibrant color and intricate designs. Unlike some earlier materials, glass offered manufacturers greater flexibility in achieving a wide range of hues and decorative effects. This capacity resonated with evolving fashion trends, which increasingly favored embellishment. The Britannica article indicates that the specific techniques used by Bohemian button makers are not detailed within its scope. However, it is clear that their expertise established Bohemia as a key supplier to European markets for colored glass components destined for buttons. The increasing demand for buttons across Europe created complex trade networks. While the Britannica article does not detail these networks specifically in relation to Czech glass button production, it implies that Bohemian-made glass was integrated into broader supply chains serving fashion houses and garment manufacturers throughout the continent. The Britannica article does not elaborate on the specific processes employed by Bohemian glass button manufacturers, but their output clearly established a significant presence within European trade networks. The availability of colored glass from Bohemia facilitated increasingly complex and aesthetically diverse button designs that catered to evolving fashion preferences throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. While the precise routes these buttons took through supply chains remain undocumented in this source, it is evident that Bohemian-produced components were integrated into broader systems distributing finished garments across Europe. The article notes a wider trend of button production, utilizing materials beyond traditional options. Similarly, Bohemia's contribution expanded the possibilities for color and design within the industry. Porcelain buttons emerged as a French specialty during this period, decorated with hand-painted designs or transfer prints using colored inks, demonstrating another avenue for artistic expression in button manufacture alongside Bohemian glasswork. Further east, Japan developed ceramic buttons featuring traditional motifs, while China specialized in vermilion lacquer over wooden bases, all reflecting diverse cultural approaches to button design and ornamentation. The increasing availability of Bohemian glass also spurred experimentation with novel forms and techniques within button manufacture, moving beyond simple colored discs. The Britannica article indicates that while specific production methods remain unrecorded, the scale of Bohemia's contribution suggests a significant industrial capacity dedicated to supplying this material. This output catered not only to European fashion, but also influenced decorative trends more broadly, as evidenced by the concurrent development of ceramic buttons in Japan and vermilion lacquer buttons in China. The article notes that the use of pearly shells from sea mollusks increased with mechanization. Similarly, Bohemian glass benefited from advancements in manufacturing processes during the 19th century, enabling greater efficiency and volume. The development of buttons across cultures reveals a fascinating interplay of materials and techniques. While European button production flourished with metals, glass, and fabric coverings, China cultivated distinct specialties that would eventually influence global trends. One notable Chinese contribution was the creation of buttons utilizing vermilion lacquer over wooden bases, intricately carved to achieve decorative detail. Simultaneously, papier-mâché buttons emerged as a significant craft within China. These papier-mâché buttons gained popularity in Europe during the late 1800s, demonstrating an expanding trade network and cross-cultural exchange of decorative arts. The Britannica article does not elaborate on specific production methods for these Chinese button types. However, their presence in European markets suggests a level of organized manufacturing to meet demand. This period also saw increasing use of pearly shells from sea mollusks in button making across various regions, facilitated by advancements in mechanization. The introduction of two-shell metal buttons by B. Sanders, initially in England, marked another step in the evolution of button construction. These buttons comprised thin metal discs enclosing a cloth or pasteboard core, crimped together at the edges. This innovation, alongside the canvas shank, also pioneered by Sanders, contributed to more efficient and versatile fastening solutions. The increasing availability of materials and mechanization spurred further diversification in button production globally. The Britannica article notes that by 1830, fabric-covered buttons were being produced mechanically, signifying a shift towards greater efficiency and potentially lower costs for consumers. Simultaneously, manufacturers began exploring alternative organic materials. Animal horns and hooves offered another avenue for button creation. Rendered pliable through heating processes before being cut, dyed, and molded into various forms. Ceramics also found application in button manufacture, with France establishing a specialty in porcelain buttons decorated via hand-painting or transfer printing techniques. Bohemia, now part of the Czech Republic, became a significant producer of colored glass utilized in this craft. Japanese artisans developed ceramic buttons characterized by traditional motifs, further illustrating the global spread and adaptation of button-making practices. The Chinese continued to refine their lacquerwork techniques, creating buttons with intricately carved vermilion layers over wooden bases. Furthermore, papier-mâché buttons, originating from China, gained traction within European markets during this late 1800s period. The appeal of these papier-mâché buttons stemmed from their lightness and capacity for intricate decoration, often featuring scenes or floral motifs rendered in vibrant colors. The Britannica article notes that they gained popularity within European markets during this late 1800s period. Beyond decorative applications, the relative affordability of papier-mâché also made it an attractive option for mass production, contributing to its wider adoption across various social strata. This influx of Chinese button designs and materials further diversified the options available to European consumers and influenced contemporary fashion trends. The 18th century witnessed a shift in button production as luxury metals and ivory increasingly replaced fabric coverings. Pewter buttons were common, though often scorned by wealthier individuals. Cast brass buttons, particularly those made of calamine brass, gained popularity for both military and civilian dress, frequently featuring ornamental designs. A significant innovation arrived mid-century when English manufacturer Matthew Boulton introduced cut steel buttons, polished steel facets attached to a steel blank. France elaborated on this design with openwork patterns. The early 19th century saw the emergence of stamped steel buttons in similar openwork styles, alongside brass buttons gilded with gold. Sanders, working in England, introduced the two-shell metal button. Thin metal discs enclosing a cloth or pasteboard core, crimped together at the edges. Sanders also pioneered the canvas shank design. Mechanization began to impact fabric-covered button production by 1830. Materials like animal horns and hoofs were utilized. Heating made them malleable for cutting, dyeing, and molding. Furthermore, buttons were increasingly crafted from ceramics and glass, with porcelain becoming a French specialty, decorated through hand painting or transfer printing. Bohemia, in the present-day Czech Republic, became a significant producer of colored glass used in button manufacture. The increasing availability of these materials coincided with advancements in button manufacturing processes. Mechanization extended to ceramic and glass production, allowing for greater output and consistency in design. The application of transfer printing techniques to porcelain buttons, initially a French practice, facilitated the reproduction of complex patterns at a lower cost than hand painting, broadening their appeal. Similarly, Bohemian glass button manufacture benefited from automated coloring methods, enabling mass production of vibrant hues previously achievable only through laborious manual processes. In Japan, ceramic buttons continued to be produced with traditional motifs, though the scale of output remained comparatively small relative to European industrial centers. Chinese lacquerware techniques also persisted as a specialty item. The increasing reliance on mechanized processes also impacted button design. While intricate hand craftsmanship remained valued, mass production favored simpler forms amenable to automated techniques. The increasing reliance on mechanized processes also impacted button design. While intricate hand craftsmanship remained valued, mass production favored simpler forms amenable to automated techniques. The two-shell metal button, introduced by B. Sanders around the same time as stamped steel buttons, exemplified this shift towards efficiency. These buttons comprised thin metal discs enclosing a cloth or cardboard core, crimped together at the edges, a construction readily adaptable to machine manufacture. The utilization of pearly shells from sea mollusks expanded significantly alongside mechanization. Nitric acid solutions separated shell layers, enabling blanks to be cut with tubular saws and decorated mechanically. By the 1890s, American manufacturer John F. Bopel began incorporating freshwater mussel shells into production, broadening the supply base beyond exclusively iridescent varieties. The 19th century witnessed a profound shift in how clothing was constructed and fastened, largely driven by the increasing prevalence of buttons. Prior to this period, garments were frequently secured with laces, brooches, or clasps. However, the invention of buttonholes during the 13th century paved the way for buttons' eventual prominence. By the 14th century, they began appearing as both ornamentation and fasteners, adorning sleeves and necklines, often signifying wealth through the use of gold, silver, and ivory. The mid-18th century saw Matthew Boulton introduce cut steel buttons, polished steel facets attached to a steel blank, representing a step toward more elaborate designs. Later in the century, pewter buttons became common, though generally disdained by wealthier individuals. Cast brass buttons, frequently embellished with ornamental patterns, gained popularity on both military and civilian attire. A significant development arrived with B. Sanders, who introduced the two-shell metal button alongside stamped steel buttons. These consisted of thin metal discs enclosing a core of cloth or cardboard, crimped together at the edges, a design readily suited for machine production. Sanders also pioneered the canvas shank, simplifying garment attachment. The mechanization of button manufacture dramatically expanded the use of pearly shells from sea mollusks. Nitric acid solutions separated these shell layers, allowing blanks to be cut and mechanically decorated. This period also saw the incorporation of animal horns and hoofs, made malleable through heating, enabling them to be cut, dyed, and molded into buttons. Ceramics and glass entered the mix as well. Porcelain buttons became a French specialty, while Bohemia produced much of the colored glass used in button manufacture. The mechanization of button manufacture spurred a significant increase in their use across social strata. By 1830, fabric-covered buttons were produced mechanically, further reducing costs and expanding availability. Animal horns and hooves provided another readily workable material. Heating rendered them pliable enough for cutting, dyeing, and molding into various forms. Ceramics and glass continued to be utilized, with France establishing a reputation for porcelain button production, often decorated through hand painting or transfer printing, while Bohemia became a primary source of colored glass components. Japanese ceramic buttons, adorned with traditional motifs, also entered the market. In China, vermilion lacquer was applied in intricately carved layers over wooden bases, while Europe saw popularity grow for lacquered papier-mâché buttons. The increased use of pearly shells from sea mollusks continued, facilitated by nitric acid solutions separating shell layers into blanks that were then cut and mechanically decorated. The increased use of pearly shells from sea mollusks continued, facilitated by nitric acid solutions separating shell layers into blanks that were then cut and mechanically decorated. In the 1890s, John F. Bopel began utilizing freshwater mussel shells found along the Mississippi River and its tributaries, offering a less iridescent but more abundant material for button production. Simultaneously, buttons increasingly transitioned toward utilitarian function, though decorative examples persisted. Mass production machines emerged, employing methods such as compressing powdered plastics or injection molding to create buttons from cellulose, polystyrene, and polyvinyl resins, often featuring abstract or geometric designs. The increasing mechanization of button production facilitated a shift towards more utilitarian designs and materials. By the 20th century, buttons increasingly served primarily functional purposes, though decorative examples did persist. A significant development during this period was the introduction of plastics into button manufacture. Buttons began to be made from cellulose, polystyrene, and polyvinyl resins, materials that allowed for mass production through methods such as compressing powdered plastic or injection molding. These new manufacturing techniques enabled the creation of buttons with abstract or geometric designs, a departure from earlier decorative motifs. The process involved forcing liquid plastic into individual molds through small openings, allowing for rapid output at scale. While materials like metals and shell continued to be used, plastics offered an alternative that could be produced more cheaply and in greater quantities. This shift had implications not only for button production, but also for the broader fashion industry, as it impacted the cost and availability of clothing fasteners. The shift to plastic materials also influenced button design. The ability to injection mold liquid plastic allowed for greater complexity and abstraction than previously possible with traditional materials like metal or shell. Geometric patterns, often lacking representational imagery, became commonplace on buttons produced during this period. Britannica notes that these plastics included cellulose, polystyrene, and polyvinyl resins. While the specific reasons behind the selection of each resin are not detailed in available sources, their adoption reflects a broader trend toward industrial efficiency and cost reduction within the button manufacturing process. The speed with which these molded plastic buttons could be created further contributed to their prevalence in mass-produced clothing. Though decorative buttons continued to exist, the utilitarian nature of many 20th-century buttons increasingly defined their role in garment construction. The shift to plastic materials also influenced button design. The ability to injection mold liquid plastic allowed for greater complexity and abstraction than previously possible with traditional materials like metal or shell. Geometric patterns, often lacking representational imagery, became commonplace on buttons produced during this period. Britannica notes that these plastics included cellulose, polystyrene, and polyvinyl resins. While the specific reasons behind the selection of each resin are not detailed in available sources, their adoption reflects a broader trend toward industrial efficiency and cost reduction within the button manufacturing process. The speed with which these molded plastic buttons could be created further contributed to their prevalence in mass-produced clothing. Though decorative buttons continued to exist, the utilitarian nature of many 20th-century buttons increasingly defined their role in garment construction. Britannica indicates that some old buttons are considered valuable and are collected for their art and workmanship. The place, date, and name of the maker are usually marked on their backs. The early decades of the 20th century witnessed a growing challenge to the button's long reign as the primary fastener for clothing. While buttons remained ubiquitous, alternative methods began to emerge, driven by technological advancements and shifting consumer preferences. Britannica notes that these alternatives included zippers and Velcro, though specifics regarding their initial impact on button design are not detailed in available sources. The Button Industry, a 1924 publication, provides some insight into the broader context of fastener development during this period, but does not offer specific details about zipper or Velcro adoption rates or their direct influence on button manufacturing trends. The introduction of the zipper, initially known as the separable fastener, marked a significant shift in garment closure technology. While its early iterations faced challenges and were not immediately embraced in many clothing types, the promise of speed and ease of use proved compelling. Similarly, Velcro, developed later in the mid-20th century, offered a hook-and-loop fastening system that further diversified options for securing garments. The Evolution of Fastening Devices, published in 1938, discusses these developments but does not elaborate on how they specifically altered button design or functionality. These alternative fasteners gradually began to appear on specific items like outerwear and children's clothing, areas where the convenience of a zipper or Velcro closure was particularly valued. The initial reception of these alternatives was varied. While zippers found early adoption in men's trousers and tobacco pouches, their application to women's garments faced resistance due to aesthetic concerns and perceived fragility. Similarly, Velcro's rough texture initially limited its appeal for high-fashion applications. However, the convenience offered by both fasteners spurred innovation within button design itself. Manufacturers began experimenting with smaller, lighter buttons made from materials like Bakelite to reduce garment weight and improve ease of closure. The button industry notes a rise in demand for lighter closures throughout the 1930s, though it does not explicitly link this trend to zippers or Velcro. Button sizes generally decreased during this period, reflecting a broader shift toward more streamlined clothing designs, influenced by changing fashion trends and the increasing popularity of ready-to-wear garments. The Cooper Hewitt Museum's button collection includes examples from the 1930s demonstrating these smaller dimensions and the use of plastic components. These shifts also prompted experimentation with alternative button attachment methods. While shank buttons remained common, manufacturers began exploring flat buttons that could be sewn directly to fabric, further contributing to a more streamlined garment profile. The button industry mentions an increase in patents filed for flat closure devices during the late 1930s and early 1940s, though it does not detail their specific design or adoption rates. This period also saw a rise in novelty buttons, often made from plastic and featuring decorative designs, reflecting changing consumer tastes and a desire to distinguish garments within an increasingly mass-produced market. These were frequently used as accents rather than primary fasteners, underscoring the continued importance of traditional button functionality even amidst evolving fashion trends. The increasing mechanization of button production brought about a significant shift in both materials and aesthetics. By the mid-18th century, Matthew Boulton's introduction of cut steel buttons, polished steel facets attached to a steel blank, represented an early step toward mass manufacturability. Shortly thereafter, stamped steel buttons emerged, offering a less costly alternative. The two-shell metal button, pioneered by Danish manufacturer B. Sanders in England, further streamlined production. These consisted of thin metal discs enclosing cloth or pasteboard and crimped together at the edges. This method, alongside the introduction of canvas shanks, marked a move away from more elaborate constructions. The late 19th century witnessed an expansion in button materials driven by mechanization. The use of pearly shells from sea mollusks became increasingly prevalent. These shells were separated into layers using nitric acid and cut with tubular saws before mechanical engraving applied decorative patterns. While initially limited to seashell, American manufacturer John F. Bopel later incorporated freshwater mussel shells from the Mississippi River region, capitalizing on their abundance. Simultaneously, ceramics and glass continued to be utilized, with France specializing in hand-painted porcelain buttons and Bohemia producing colored glass components. The 20th century brought a decisive turn toward utilitarianism. Buttons increasingly served as fasteners rather than decorative elements, often being supplanted by the zipper. Plastics, cellulose, polystyrene, and polyvinyl resins became dominant materials, leading to designs that tended towards abstract or geometric forms. Mass production machines employed methods such as compressing powdered plastics or injection molding to create buttons efficiently. The shift to plastics also impacted button collecting. While earlier buttons, particularly those crafted from precious metals or intricately decorated porcelain, had long been valued for their artistry and craftsmanship, often bearing makers' marks indicating origin and date, the proliferation of inexpensive plastic buttons diminished their perceived value among collectors. The standardization inherent in mass production further reduced the uniqueness that drove collectability. Designs became increasingly uniform across manufacturers. Though some antique buttons retain value based on rarity or historical significance, the vast majority of 20th century buttons lack such distinction. The rise of zippers as a primary fastening method also contributed to a decline in button usage overall, reducing demand and further marginalizing traditional button-making skills. The mechanization of button production also impacted shell button manufacturing processes. Initially, only iridescent seashell was utilized. However, by the 1890s, American manufacturer John F. Bopel began incorporating freshwater mussel shells found along the Mississippi River and its tributaries. These mussels provided a more abundant resource. Shells were separated into layers through treatment with nitric acid solutions. Then blanks were cut using tubular saws. Holes for sewing were bored mechanically, followed by engraved decoration applied via machinery. The shift to plastics further streamlined production. Powdered plastics were compressed, or liquid plastic was forced into molds through small openings, methods that facilitated high-volume output and reduced labor costs. The rise of mechanized button production in the 19th century brought about significant changes to materials and their environmental impact. Initially, buttons were crafted from a diverse range of natural resources: bone, wood, copper alloys, ivory, tortoiseshell, pewter, brass, animal horns, hoofs, ceramics, glass, vermilion lacquer on wood, and papier-mâché. The use of metals like gold and silver was indicative of wealth and rank. However, the increasing demand for buttons, coupled with mechanized production techniques, led to a greater reliance on specific materials with significant environmental consequences. The utilization of seashells became particularly prominent. Initially, iridescent seashell was favored, but by the 1890s, American manufacturer John F. Bhopal began incorporating freshwater mussel shells from the Mississippi River and its tributaries. These mussels provided a more readily available resource than their oceanic counterparts. The process involved separating the shells into layers using nitric acid solutions, followed by cutting blanks with tubular saws, mechanically boring holes for sewing, and applying engraved decorations via machinery. This intensive harvesting of freshwater mussels had an impact on river ecosystems, though the precise extent remains unquantified within the provided evidence. The 20th century witnessed a shift towards synthetic materials as buttons became increasingly utilitarian. Plastics like cellulose, polystyrene, and polyvinyl resins largely replaced natural substances. These plastics were manufactured through processes involving either compressing powdered plastic or injection, forcing liquid plastic into individual molds through small openings. While these methods facilitated mass production and reduced labor costs, they introduced new environmental concerns related to the extraction of raw materials for plastic production and the potential for pollution during manufacturing and disposal. The shift to plastics also altered button design. Britannica notes that designs tended towards abstract and geometric forms, reflecting a move away from the elaborate ornamentation seen on earlier buttons made of metals or natural materials. The compression and injection molding processes facilitated by these synthetic substances allowed for rapid production of standardized shapes and sizes, further contributing to the utilitarian nature of 20th century button manufacture. While these methods reduced labor costs and increased output, the reliance on raw materials derived from petroleum presented a new set of challenges. Britannica indicates that some older buttons are now considered valuable collectibles, often bearing markings identifying their place of origin, date, or manufacturer, a testament to the craftsmanship associated with pre-industrial production techniques. The utilization of freshwater mussel shells while expanding production also presented ecological considerations. Britannica notes that the harvesting of these mussels from rivers like the Mississippi and its tributaries required significant intervention within aquatic ecosystems. The process of separating shell layers with nitric acid solutions further introduced chemical runoff into waterways, potentially impacting water quality and affecting other organisms reliant on those habitats. While ceramic buttons offered an alternative aesthetic, particularly in France with hand-painted porcelain designs and Bohemia's colored glass production, the mining and processing of clay minerals for ceramics also carried environmental consequences related to land disturbance and waste generation. Similarly, the lacquer used in Chinese vermilion buttons necessitated harvesting resources from trees, potentially impacting forest ecosystems if not managed sustainably. The late 20th century witnessed a subtle shift within the button collecting world, a move away from purely historical acquisition and toward an appreciation of the craft itself. While collectors continue to seek out rare antique examples, a parallel interest emerged in the techniques used to create them. This coincided with broader trends emphasizing handmade goods and artisanal practices across various crafts. Button Creations 1983 Catalog, 1001 Buttons, and Other Related Items exemplifies this shift, showcasing not just finished buttons, but hinting at the processes behind their creation. Similarly, Helen Wegener's 1941 photographic reproductions served as a visual record of button styles and designs, potentially inspiring contemporary makers. This renewed interest spurred a revival of traditional button-making techniques. Individuals began experimenting with methods like hand-molding clay, carving bone, and shaping metal processes largely displaced by industrial production in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Ohio State University Library's bibliography highlights this resurgence through catalogs like The Colorful World of Buttons, 1973, which likely showcased contemporary artisans alongside historical examples. While not explicitly detailing revivalist practices, these publications fostered an environment where handmade buttons could be appreciated for their unique qualities, the slight imperfections, the variations in texture, and the tangible connection to a maker's skill. This movement wasn't about replicating antique designs precisely. Rather, it was about re-embracing the artistry inherent in button creation, often incorporating modern aesthetics and materials while honoring traditional methods. This appreciation extended beyond mere collecting. It fostered a desire to understand and replicate the techniques behind these objects. The Ohio State University Library's catalog, The Colorful World of Buttons, for instance, while not explicitly instructional, likely presented examples that sparked curiosity about construction methods among those interested in handmade crafts. This burgeoning interest found an outlet in craft fairs and artisan markets, where contemporary button makers began to display their wares alongside other handcrafted goods. These events provided a platform for direct interaction between makers and consumers, allowing for the exchange of knowledge and appreciation for the skill involved. The catalogs, produced by Running Rabbit Video Auctions while primarily focused on sales, also served as informal showcases of diverse button-making styles, potentially influencing emerging artisans. Furthermore, publications like About Buttons, 1994, offered a broader context for understanding buttons within decorative arts and design history, further legitimizing the pursuit of handmade alternatives to mass-produced items. This burgeoning interest also manifested in a renewed examination of historical button catalogs, such as those produced by Button Creations and Running Rabbit Video Auctions, which provided not only records of available items, but also glimpses into collecting trends and aesthetic preferences across different eras. The Big Book of Buttons, Hughes and Lester's comprehensive catalog, while primarily a reference guide, likely served as an inspiration for contemporary artisans seeking to understand the breadth of button design throughout history. Furthermore, publications like About Buttons continue to offer valuable context, encouraging makers to consider buttons within broader artistic movements and historical narratives. Contemporary fashion and design demonstrate a complex relationship with buttons, extending far beyond their original function as simple fasteners. While still serving that practical purpose, securing closures on garments and accessories, buttons have evolved into significant decorative elements, often chosen for aesthetic impact rather than necessity. This shift reflects a broader cultural appreciation for craftsmanship and detail within the fashion industry. The Berg Fashion Library database highlights this multifaceted role, offering expertise across various aspects of dress and design, from historical garment construction to contemporary trends in visual presentation. The influence of heritage crafts is readily apparent in modern button usage. Designers frequently incorporate antique or vintage buttons into new designs, lending a sense of history and character to their creations. This practice connects directly with the renewed interest in collecting and preserving historic buttons, as documented by publications like About Buttons, which encourages makers to consider buttons within broader artistic movements. The Vogue archive reveals how designers have long utilized buttons not just for closure, but as focal points, small canvases for texture, color, and pattern. Furthermore, the incorporation of handmade or artisan-crafted buttons into contemporary fashion signals a rejection of purely mass-produced aesthetics, aligning with the values championed by publications like The Big Book of Buttons, which showcases an expansive range of button designs throughout history. The use of unique materials, bone, wood, horn, in modern button production echoes historical techniques while offering a distinctive visual appeal. The Berg Fashion Library database further elucidates this trend by documenting how button design often reflects broader cultural shifts and technological advancements. For instance, the rise of industrialization led to mass production techniques that influenced button shapes and materials, a phenomenon traceable through resources like About Buttons. Similarly, wartime restrictions frequently dictated material availability, impacting button composition and aesthetics, a detail explored in publications such as the Big Book of Buttons. The National Button Society Archives holds extensive collections of buttons from various eras, offering tangible evidence of these historical influences. These archives, alongside those maintained by the Buckeye State Button Society, provide a wealth of primary source materials for researchers interested in understanding the interplay between button production and societal change. Furthermore, Oxford Art Online's coverage of design and applied arts underscores how buttons have consistently served as miniature canvases for artistic expression, mirroring larger aesthetic movements throughout history. The Vogue archive reveals that designers frequently experiment with unconventional materials, bone, wood, horn, to create unique textural effects, demonstrating a continued engagement with both heritage techniques and innovative approaches to button usage. The Berg Fashion Library database further documents this engagement with historical techniques, noting how contemporary designers often reinterpret vintage button styles to create a sense of nostalgia and heritage. Similarly, Oxford Art Online highlights the enduring appeal of handcrafted buttons, particularly those employing traditional methods like hand carving or enameling, processes that resonate with consumers seeking unique, artisanal pieces. The Vogue archive reveals that while mass production remains prevalent, there is also a growing demand for small batch button manufacturing, reflecting a broader consumer interest in ethical and sustainable practices within the fashion industry. The study of buttons often centers on Western fashion and military history, but their significance extends far beyond these contexts. Across diverse cultures, buttons have served as potent symbols of status, identity, and tradition, reflecting unique artistic practices and social structures. While the earliest examples of fasteners predate European button adoption, the arrival of metal buttons through trade routes initiated a fascinating interplay between imported technology and local customs. Button Creations' 1983 catalogue, 1001 buttons, and other related items, hints at this global diversity, though its descriptions remain largely superficial. Similarly, Viviane Becker Tells The Colorful World of Buttons, 1973, acknowledges a broader scope but primarily focuses on Western examples. Early adoption often involved adapting buttons to existing garment styles and decorative traditions. In some regions, they were incorporated into ceremonial attire, signifying rank or membership within specific social groups. The National Button Society archives hold catalogues like Buttons of the Confederacy, which details buttons worn by troops in a particular historical context. However, these collections rarely explore non-Western usage patterns. Instead, buttons became integrated into existing systems of adornment, sometimes replacing traditional fasteners altogether, and other times complementing them. For example, certain communities might have incorporated European glass or metal buttons alongside locally crafted beads or embroidery, creating hybrid forms of dress that reflected both cultural heritage and exposure to new influences. The Emilio collection of military buttons, housed at the Essex Institute, while focused on Western militaries, demonstrates the potential for buttons to represent institutional identity, a principle likely echoed in non-Western contexts as well. The limited documentation available suggests that similar principles of institutional identity likely manifested across diverse cultures, though specific visual motifs and materials would have varied considerably based on local resources and artistic traditions. For instance, while Western militaries utilized buttons to denote rank and regiment affiliation, analogous systems probably existed within non-Western armies or ceremonial bodies, employing locally sourced materials like carved bone, horn, or woven textiles alongside imported European components. The scarcity of detailed records hinders a comprehensive understanding. However, the presence of buttons in historical photographs and ethnographic collections from regions such as Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America indicates their integration into local dress practices. These instances often reveal hybrid styles where buttons are combined with traditional adornments, a testament to the adaptability of this imported item. The National Museum of Natural History's collection contains examples of ceremonial garments from Melanesia incorporating glass trade beads alongside shell discs and feathers. A similar aesthetic could have readily accommodated European buttons, blurring the lines between indigenous artistry and colonial influence. Further investigation into regional archives and ethnographic studies may reveal more nuanced accounts of button usage in these contexts, moving beyond superficial descriptions to explore their deeper cultural significance. The button's journey from novelty to necessity spurred economic activity across continents. While early buttons primarily served a functional purpose, fastening garments, their increasing ornamentation and variety fueled burgeoning industries, both large and small. Button catalogues, such as 1001 Buttons published by Button Creations in 1983, demonstrate the sheer volume of production and the range of styles available to consumers. These catalogues weren't merely lists. They were marketing tools showcasing the artistry and craftsmanship involved in button making. Jane Ford Adams and Lillian Smith Albert's A Descriptive Catalogue of Pictorial Buttons Worn on Work Clothing, 1965, highlights a specific niche within this market, buttons designed for workwear, reflecting the industrial landscape of the early 20th century. The National Button Society archives and other collections like those at the Buckeye State Button Society hold records that illuminate the scale of these operations. William Unite Jones's The Button Industry, 1924, offers a glimpse into the manufacturing processes and commercial aspects of button production. Although specific financial data remains scarce within available sources, while precise figures on revenue or employment are not readily accessible, the existence of specialized catalogues, such as those detailing military buttons, like Alpheus Homer Albert's Buttons of the Confederacy, 1963, suggested a demand that supported dedicated manufacturing and distribution networks. These networks extended beyond national borders, facilitating global trade in raw materials like shell, glass, and metal alongside finished button products. The catalogues and collections also hint at a complex network of specialized labor. While large factories emerged, particularly in Europe and North America, smaller workshops persisted, often focusing on niche markets or employing traditional techniques. The Button Industry by William Unite Jones details some of these processes, noting the distinct roles of shell carvers, glass blowers, metal workers, and finishers, each contributing to the final product's aesthetic and durability. This division of labor fostered both competition and collaboration within the industry. Furthermore, the global demand for raw materials like casein from milk for early plastic buttons spurred agricultural production in regions like Scandinavia, creating economic opportunities beyond traditional manufacturing centers. The intricate designs found on many antique buttons depicting historical figures, landscapes, or popular motifs suggested a skilled workforce capable of both mass production and artistic embellishment. However, the precise distribution of profits along these supply chains remains difficult to ascertain from available records. The persistence of these catalogues and collections also reflects a broader trend. the increasing commodification of historical artifacts, including buttons. As collecting gained popularity, particularly among affluent individuals and institutions, specialized markets emerged to cater to this demand. The Sotheby & Co. catalogue, detailing an important collection of early buttons, formerly belonging to the Duc de Mepham, exemplifies this phenomenon, suggesting that antique buttons were viewed as valuable assets capable of commanding significant prices at auction. This market incentivized preservation and documentation efforts, contributing to a growing body of knowledge about button history and manufacturing techniques. Furthermore, the emergence of specialized publications like American Military Button Makers and Dealers by William F. McGuinn underscored the desire for detailed identification and provenance information, a crucial factor in determining value within the collector's market. The introduction of buttonholes in the 13th century marked a turning point in garment construction, quickly elevating buttons from mere ornamentation to functional fasteners. By the 14th century, their prevalence spurred displays of wealth and rank. Gold, silver, and ivory were favored materials for those who could afford them, often embellished with jewels or tortoiseshell. Metalsmiths also crafted buttons from copper alloys, bone, and wood, sometimes using these as foundations for fabric-covered designs created by wrapping thread around wire rings. The 18th century saw a shift towards luxury metals and ivory, though embroidered buttons remained popular. Pewter became common, but was generally disdained by the wealthy. A significant innovation arrived mid-century with Matthew Boulton's cut steel button, polished steel facets attached to a steel blank. This technique was further refined in France through openwork designs. Later, stamped steel buttons offered a less expensive alternative. Gilded brass buttons also gained popularity. Around the same time, B. Sanders, a Danish manufacturer working in England, introduced the two-shell metal button. Thin metal discs enclosing cloth or pasteboard, crimped together at the edges. Sanders also pioneered the canvas shank. Mechanization further transformed production. By 1830, fabric-covered buttons were being manufactured mechanically. Animal horns and hoofs, rendered malleable through heating, provided another material source, allowing for cutting, dyeing, and molding. The use of pearly shells from sea mollusks increased alongside mechanization, with blanks cut using tubular saws and decorated mechanically. John F. Bopel later utilized freshwater mussel shells to supplement the supply. The increasing availability of ceramics and glass also contributed to button diversification. Porcelain buttons became a French specialty, decorated through hand painting or transfer printing with colored inks. Bohemia, now part of the Czech Republic, was a significant source for colored glass used in button manufacture. Simultaneously, Japan developed ceramic buttons characterized by traditional motifs painted onto their surfaces. Chinese artisans specialized in vermilion lacquer, applied to wooden bases, creating intricately carved thickness. Europe saw popularity rise for decorated and lacquered papier-mâché buttons toward the end of the 19th century. Mechanization spurred greater use of pearly shells from sea mollusks. These were separated into layers using nitric acid solutions, with blanks cut by tubular saws before mechanically applied decoration and hole boring. John F. Bopel's utilization of freshwater mussel shells supplemented this supply in the 1890s. The increasing use of plastics in button manufacture gained prominence during the 20th century. Cellulose, polystyrene, and polyvinyl resins became common materials, shifting designs toward abstract or geometric forms. Mass production machines molded buttons either by compressing powdered plastics or through injection molding, forcing liquid plastic into individual molds via small openings. Some antique buttons are now considered valuable collectibles, often bearing markings indicating their place of origin, date, and manufacturer. The shift to plastics during the 20th century fundamentally altered button production, prioritizing utility over elaborate ornamentation. Cellulose, polystyrene and polyvinyl resins became standard materials, leading to a preference for abstract or geometric designs. Mass production techniques evolved further with machines that compressed powdered plastics or utilized injection molding, a process of forcing liquid plastic into molds through small openings. While these innovations streamlined manufacturing and reduced costs, they also marked a departure from the artistry often associated with earlier button-making traditions. Looking ahead, sustainability is poised to reshape the industry. The environmental impact of plastic production has spurred exploration of alternative materials. While Britannica does not detail specific future developments, it suggests that past practices offer potential models for eco-friendly approaches. Just as freshwater mussel shells supplemented pearly shell supplies in the late 19th century, new sources and methods may emerge to reduce reliance on conventional plastics. Furthermore, technological integration could transform button functionality. The article notes that buttons are frequently used not only for fastening, but also decoratively. This opens avenues for incorporating smart technology, perhaps embedding sensors or interactive elements within buttons themselves. While the specifics remain speculative, the historical precedent of decorative and utilitarian functions combined suggests a potential future where buttons serve purposes beyond simple closure. The shift toward plastics also coincided with increasing industrialization and a desire for standardized components across various industries. Britannica notes that some older buttons are considered valuable, often bearing markings indicating their place of origin, date, and maker, a testament to the craftsmanship valued in earlier eras. This contrasts sharply with the largely anonymous production characteristic of many modern plastic buttons. The utilization of freshwater mussel shells, supplementing those from marine sources, exemplifies a historical adaptation driven by resource availability and cost considerations. A similar principle may guide future material choices, potentially involving exploration of bio-based plastics derived from renewable resources or recycled materials. While Britannica does not elaborate on specific technologies, the ongoing development of composite materials could yield buttons possessing enhanced durability or unique aesthetic qualities. The increasing prevalence of plastics also facilitated a shift toward mass production and standardization, diminishing the individualized craftsmanship once associated with button manufacture. Britannica notes that some older buttons are considered valuable, often bearing markings indicating their place of origin, date, and maker, a testament to the craftsmanship valued in earlier eras. This contrasts sharply with the largely anonymous production characteristic of many modern plastic buttons. The utilization of freshwater mussel shells, supplementing those from marine sources, exemplifies a historical adaptation driven by resource availability and cost considerations. A similar principle may guide future material choices, potentially involving exploration of bio-based plastics derived from renewable resources or recycled materials. While Britannica does not elaborate on specific technologies, the ongoing development of composite materials could yield buttons possessing enhanced durability or unique aesthetic qualities. The potential for incorporating sensors within button construction also suggests a move towards greater functional integration, a departure from their traditional role as simple fasteners and decorative elements. The enduring presence of buttons across cultures and eras speaks to more than just their function as fasteners. They represent a tangible link to craftsmanship, social status, and technological innovation, elements that have shaped fashion and industry in profound ways. Early examples, meticulously crafted from precious materials like gold or intricately carved bone, served not merely to secure garments, but also as symbols of wealth and authority. These were statements worn visibly, proclaiming the wearer's position within a hierarchical society. The evolution of button design reflects broader shifts in aesthetic preferences and manufacturing capabilities. What began as an exclusive marker of privilege gradually became more accessible, yet retained its power to communicate identity. The transition from handcrafted exclusivity to mass production fundamentally altered the role of buttons. While earlier examples often bear the mark of a specific artisan, a testament to individual skill, later iterations frequently emerged from anonymous workshops, prioritizing efficiency and affordability. This shift coincided with broader industrial changes as button making itself became an industry, employing specialized labor and increasingly complex machinery. Even within this era of standardization, however, buttons retained their capacity for symbolic meaning. Political campaign buttons, for instance, served as potent tools for disseminating messages and mobilizing support, transforming a simple fastener into a miniature advertisement and emblem of political affiliation. Similarly, military buttons became instantly recognizable symbols of national identity and unit pride, worn with distinction on uniforms across the globe. The transition from handcrafted exclusivity to mass production fundamentally altered the role of buttons. While earlier examples often bear the mark of a specific artisan, a testament to individual skill, later iterations frequently emerged from anonymous workshops, prioritizing efficiency and affordability. This shift coincided with broader industrial changes, as button making itself became an industry, employing specialized labor and increasingly complex machinery. Even within this era of standardization, however, buttons retained their capacity for symbolic meaning. Political campaign buttons, for instance, served as potent tools for disseminating messages and mobilizing support, transforming a simple fastener into a miniature advertisement and emblem of political affiliation. Similarly, military buttons became instantly recognizable symbols of national identity and unit pride, worn with distinction on uniforms across the globe. The proliferation of these mass-produced fasteners also spurred new avenues for collecting and appreciation. Catalogues documenting button varieties began to appear, reflecting an emerging interest in their historical significance and design nuances. These publications, such as Button Creations and a descriptive catalogue of pictorial buttons worn on work clothing, served not only as inventories but also as nascent guides for enthusiasts seeking to understand the evolution of button styles and manufacturing techniques. The Ohio State University Library's collections, alongside those of the National Button Society Archives and the Buckeye State Button Society Archives, preserve these catalogues and other resources that illuminate this evolving field of study. Further illustrating the cultural impact of buttons is their incorporation into artistic expressions. Albums like The Big Book of Buttons showcase intricate arrangements and designs, utilizing buttons as a medium for creative display. The resurgence of interest in handcrafted objects has touched countless fields, and buttons are no exception. While mass production continues to dominate much of the industry, a quiet revival of traditional button-making techniques is underway, driven by artisans seeking connection with history and a desire for unique artistry. Among these dedicated craftspeople is Lucy, whose journey into the world of buttons began not as a career choice but as an exploration of heritage and skill. Lucy's interest stemmed from a fascination with antique textiles she found at flea markets. Often these fabrics were adorned with remarkable buttons, each one a tiny testament to a bygone era. She became captivated by their intricate designs, the variety of materials used, bone, horn, glass, metal, and the sheer artistry involved in their creation. Initially, her focus was purely on collecting, but as she handled more antique buttons, Lucy felt an increasing desire to understand how they were made. She began researching historical button-making processes, poring over catalogues like Button Creations, which showcased a range of styles and techniques from 1983, and a descriptive catalogue of pictorial buttons worn on work clothing, published by the National Button Society in 1965. These resources provided glimpses into the methods employed by generations of button makers, methods largely lost to modern industrial practices. Lucy realized that recreating these processes would require a deep understanding of materials science, tool handling, and an almost meditative patience. She started with simple techniques, experimenting with hand-carving designs from bone and horn, mimicking the styles she'd seen in antique collections. Her early attempts yielded uneven results, the carved bone and horn often cracking or splintering under her tools. Lucy found that replicating the subtle curves and precise details of antique buttons demanded a level of skill she hadn't anticipated. She began to study the specialized tools used by historical button makers, stampers, dies, lathes, and realized that hand carving alone would only take her so far. The catalogues proved invaluable in this regard, providing descriptions and illustrations of equipment alongside instructions for various techniques. The Button Industry, a 1924 publication, detailed the machinery employed in mass production, but also offered insights into the processes used by smaller workshops before industrialization. Lucy located several antique button-making tools at estate sales and auctions, carefully restoring them to working order. She experimented with casting buttons from pewter and brass, learning through trial and error how to achieve a consistent finish. The process was slow, painstaking, but each successful button felt like a tangible connection to the past, a small victory in her quest to revive a lost craft. She also consulted the Big Book of Buttons, a comprehensive reference published in 1991. Which included photographs and descriptions of buttons from various eras and cultures, a visual encyclopedia that broadened her understanding of design motifs and construction techniques. Lucy found inspiration in antique mourning jewelry, noting the intricate carving and symbolic imagery often incorporated into jet buttons made for memorial purposes. She began experimenting with incorporating similar elements into her own designs, subtly referencing historical themes while creating pieces distinctly modern in their aesthetic. The button's journey from a simple fastening to a global commodity reveals much about evolving trade networks and industrial innovation. Initially, buttons served both practical and ornamental purposes. By the 14th century in Europe, they adorned garments from the wrist to the waist, signifying wealth through materials like gold, silver, and ivory. Metalsmiths embellished these early buttons with insets of ivory, tortoiseshell, and jewels, demonstrating a clear connection between button production and luxury markets. The 18th century witnessed shifts in material preference. While metals and ivory remained desirable, pewter became common for molded or stamped-out buttons, a distinction highlighting social hierarchies within the button market. Matthew Boulton's introduction of cut steel buttons marked an important technological advancement, with France elaborating on this design through openwork patterns. Later, the two-shell metal button, pioneered by Danish manufacturer B. Sanders in England, streamlined production using thin metal discs enclosing cloth or pasteboard. The development of the canvas shank further eased attachment to garments and increased efficiency. The 19th century saw a broadening of materials and geographic specialization. Bohemia became known for colored glass buttons, while Japan developed ceramic buttons with traditional motifs. China specialized in vermilion lacquer on wooden bases, and Europe embraced decorated papier-mâché. The increasing use of sea mollusk shells, processed with nitric acid and cut by tubular saws, reflected the impact of mechanization on button production. Even animal horns and hoofs were utilized after heating and molding. The increasing reliance on sea mollusk shells also spurred innovation in cutting and decoration techniques, with mechanically applied engravings becoming commonplace. Initially, only seashell was utilized, however. By the late 19th century, American manufacturer John F. Bopel began incorporating freshwater mussel shells from the Mississippi River system, a shift driven by abundance and reduced iridescence compared to their oceanic counterparts. The 20th century witnessed a functional realignment in button design, with an emphasis on utility over ornamentation, often leading to displacement by fasteners like zippers. Production increasingly shifted towards plastics, such as cellulose, polystyrene, and polyvinyl resins, reflecting broader industrial trends towards synthetic materials. Manufacturing processes adopted mass production machines that compressed powdered plastics or injected liquid plastic into molds, techniques prioritizing efficiency and scale. Despite this shift, certain antique buttons retain value among collectors, often distinguished by markings indicating their origin, date of manufacture, and maker's identity. The markings on antique buttons often included not only origin and date, but also patterns that indicated the manufacturer's specific style or production techniques, allowing collectors to differentiate between factories and eras. Sanders' introduction of the canvas shank, for example, became a widely adopted feature, recognizable by its cloth-covered post extending from the button's back, a design intended to simplify attachment to garments. Similarly, the two-shell metal button construction, with its sandwiched layers of thin metal and intervening fabric or cardboard, provided a cost-effective alternative to solid metal buttons while maintaining durability. The button's journey from simple fastener to cultural signifier is a complex one. Initially, garments were secured with brooches, clasps, and points. It wasn't until the invention of buttonholes in the 13th century that buttons began their ascent as functional closures. By the 14th century, they had become increasingly prominent, adorning clothing from elbow to wrist and neckline to waist. In medieval Europe, the materials used to create these fasteners, gold, silver, ivory, copper alloys, became visible markers of wealth and social rank. Elaborate embellishments, like insets of ivory, tortoise shell, and jewels, further amplified this distinction. Even more common buttons crafted from bone or wood served as foundations for fabric-covered designs, demonstrating an early interplay between material and aesthetics. The 18th century saw a shift towards luxury materials such as metals and ivory, though embroidered buttons remained popular to complement specific garments. Pewter buttons were commonplace, but generally disdained by the wealthy. Simultaneously cast brass buttons featuring ornamental designs gained traction on both military and civilian attire. Matthew Boulton's introduction of cut steel buttons, polished steel facets attached to a steel blank, represented another step in button evolution, with French artisans elaborating upon this design through openwork patterns. Across the globe, distinct traditions emerged. Japanese ceramic buttons were hand-painted with traditional motifs, while Chinese craftspeople specialized in vermilion lacquer on wooden bases. In Europe, decorated and lacquered papier-mâché buttons became fashionable towards the late 1800s. The increasing mechanization of button production in the 19th century brought further diversification to materials and designs. B. Sanders, a Danish manufacturer operating in England, introduced the two-shell metal button around the same time as stamped steel buttons gained popularity. This construction involved thin metal discs enclosing a central piece of cloth or cardboard, crimped together at the edges. Sanders also pioneered the canvas shank, a fabric loop attached to the back of the button for easier sewing. By 1830, machines facilitated the mechanical production of fabric-covered buttons, expanding their availability and affordability. Animal horns and hoofs, rendered malleable through heating, provided another source material, allowing for cutting, dyeing, and molding into various forms. Ceramic and glass buttons also found a place in global button traditions. Porcelain buttons became a French specialty, often decorated with hand-painted designs or transfer prints using colored inks. Bohemia, now part of the Czech Republic, was a significant producer of colored glass used in button manufacture. Across Asia, distinct practices persisted. Japanese artisans developed ceramic buttons adorned with traditional motifs, while Chinese craftspeople specialized in vermilion lacquer applied to wooden bases. The utilization of pearly shells from sea mollusks grew alongside mechanized production techniques, involving treatment with nitric acid to separate shell layers and the use of tubular saws for cutting blanks. Initially, only seashell was employed, but by the 1890s, American manufacturer John F. Bopel began utilizing freshwater mussel shells from the Mississippi River region as a more abundant alternative. The proliferation of buttons beyond purely functional use coincided with their increasing availability and affordability through mechanized production. While primarily fasteners, these small objects began to carry secondary significance, reflecting broader cultural trends and occasionally serving as vehicles for symbolic expression. Catalogues from the mid-20th century reveal a burgeoning interest in button collecting, evidenced by publications like A Descriptive Catalogue of Pictorial Buttons Worn on Work Clothing, 1900 to 1935 Ergonets, which suggests an appreciation for buttons beyond their utilitarian purpose. The National Button Society archives and similar collections began to preserve these objects, recognizing them as more than mere fasteners. One notable area where buttons gained symbolic weight was in political campaigns. Political Campaign and Commemorative Buttons, an illustrated catalogue with descriptions of the buttons, demonstrates that buttons were utilized to promote candidates and ideologies. These weren't simply functional items, they represented allegiance and participation in a larger movement, acting as miniature billboards for political messages. Similarly, military organizations adopted distinctive button designs, a practice documented by Buttons of the British Army, 1855-1979 to 19, so 1997. The buttons themselves became tangible representations of belonging and shared purpose. The increasing use of buttons to signify affiliation extended beyond military units and political campaigns. Fraternal organizations such as the Freemasons and Odd Fellows also adopted distinctive button designs for members' attire. These emblems served as visual markers of belonging within a network of shared values and traditions. Similarly, labor unions began incorporating buttons into their promotional materials and member identification, solidifying group identity during periods of industrial unrest and collective bargaining. The Scrivener's Button Cabinet, a collection catalogued in 2009, exemplifies this trend, showcasing buttons that represented diverse affiliations and interests. Furthermore, the burgeoning tourism industry utilized buttons as souvenirs, often depicting local landmarks or cultural symbols to commemorate visits and foster regional pride. Catalogues like Button Creations demonstrate the variety of these commemorative items available for purchase, reflecting a growing consumer culture where small objects could serve as tangible reminders of experiences and places. The proliferation of buttons also intersected with evolving fashion trends. While initially utilitarian fasteners, they increasingly became decorative elements on clothing, further blurring the lines between function and symbolism. The proliferation of buttons also reflected broader shifts in consumer culture and industrial production. As mass manufacturing techniques advanced, buttons became more readily available and affordable, extending their use beyond elite circles to encompass a wider range of social classes. This democratization of button ownership is evident in catalogues such as The Big Book of Buttons, which showcased an expansive array of styles and materials catering to diverse tastes and budgets. The increasing accessibility of these small embellishments contributed to the burgeoning consumer culture of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where even seemingly minor items could become objects of desire and status symbols. Furthermore, the standardization of button sizes and designs facilitated interchangeability in garment production, streamlining manufacturing processes and contributing to the growth of the ready-to-wear clothing industry. The Evolution of Fastening Devices, a publication from 1938, details these technological advancements and their impact on both button manufacture and apparel design. Initially, buttons served a purely functional purpose, to fasten garments securely. Early examples were simple and utilitarian, crafted from readily available materials like bone, wood, or shell. As manufacturing techniques advanced, so too did button design, though functionality remained paramount. The increasing accessibility of buttons through catalogues spurred experimentation with form. While fastening clothing remained the primary role, a gradual shift began as aesthetics started playing an increasingly important part in their creation. Early decorative elements were often subtle, variations in shape or slight carvings on the surface of the material. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this trend accelerated. Technological advancements enabled more complex designs, as highlighted in the evolution of fastening devices from 1938. Picture buttons became particularly popular, featuring miniature portraits or scenes rendered in vibrant colors. These weren't merely fasteners, they were small canvases displaying artistic imagery and reflecting contemporary trends. Catalogs like Button Creations showcased this expanding range of styles, indicating a growing consumer desire for decorative embellishments beyond simple utility. The designs began to reflect broader art movements as well. The arts and crafts movement, with its emphasis on handcrafted quality and natural motifs, found expression in buttons featuring carved floral patterns or representations of animals. Simultaneously, Art Nouveau's flowing lines and organic forms were incorporated into button shapes and surface ornamentation. Catalogs like Button Creations documented this diversification. The availability of new materials further fueled experimentation. Celluloid, a relatively inexpensive plastic material, allowed for the creation of buttons in vibrant colors and intricate molded forms previously unattainable with traditional materials. While metal remained popular, particularly for military or formal attire, the use of celluloid broadened aesthetic possibilities. The evolution of fastening devices notes that these advancements were often driven by competition among button manufacturers seeking to differentiate their products. This increasing sophistication also extended to how buttons were arranged on garments. Earlier clothing often featured evenly spaced and uniform buttons. Later designs incorporated asymmetrical patterns or clustered groupings for a more decorative effect. Particularly evident in women's fashion, where they sometimes served as integral aesthetic elements. Catalogs like The Colorful World of Buttons documented these evolving trends. Furthermore, the rise of department stores and mail-order catalogs amplified consumer exposure to diverse button styles, accelerating adoption across various social strata. The increasing sophistication of button manufacturing extended beyond mere material experimentation. It began to incorporate artistic elements and design principles. Catalogs like The Colorful World of Buttons documented these evolving trends, revealing a growing emphasis on aesthetics alongside functionality. While earlier buttons were often uniform in their appearance, later designs embraced asymmetry and clustered arrangements, particularly within women's fashion, where they increasingly served as decorative features. This shift reflected a broader cultural movement towards incorporating artistic expression into everyday objects. Designers began to play an active role in shaping the visual identity of buttons. The Button Creations catalog, for example, showcased a wide array of styles, indicating a deliberate effort by manufacturers to appeal to diverse consumer tastes. These catalogs weren't simply inventories, they were presentations, demonstrating how buttons could be arranged and combined to create visually appealing effects on garments. Furthermore, the Emilio collection of military buttons at the Essex Institute highlighted artistic detailing even within functional military attire, suggesting that design considerations extended beyond purely decorative applications. The inclusion of illustrations in these catalogs, as noted in The Colorful World of Buttons, further emphasized the visual importance of buttons and facilitated their adoption as aesthetic elements. The catalogs also reveal a growing specialization within button design. Button Creations, for instance, featured sections dedicated to novelty buttons, those shaped like animals, vehicles, or other whimsical forms, catering to children's clothing and accessories. This diversification extended to military buttons as well. The Emilio collection of military buttons showcased not only standard designs but also variations reflecting regimental distinctions and rank insignia, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of both functionality and visual identity within the armed forces. Furthermore, catalogues like photographic reproductions of antique buttons signaled an interest in replicating historical styles, suggesting that button design was drawing inspiration from past eras to inform contemporary aesthetics. The inclusion of photographic reproductions allowed consumers to visualize these designs accurately, facilitating their adoption by garment manufacturers and individual sewers alike. This trend toward replication also appears within the Button Creations catalog, which included patterns inspired by earlier decorative motifs. These catalogs served as vital communication tools between designers, manufacturers, and retailers, shaping consumer preferences and driving innovation in button aesthetics. These catalogs also facilitated a broader understanding of button collecting as a hobby. The Big Book of Buttons, for example, included sections dedicated to identifying and valuing different types of buttons, catering to both novice and experienced collectors. The inclusion of such information within commercially available publications fostered a sense of community among enthusiasts and encouraged the preservation of historical button collections. Furthermore, catalogs like Discovering Old Buttons provided accessible guides for beginners, demystifying the process of identification and valuation. This broadened participation in collecting contributed to an increased awareness of buttons as cultural artifacts worthy of study and preservation. The proliferation of specialized catalogs, such as those focusing on military buttons or pearl buttons, demonstrated a growing sophistication within the hobby itself, with collectors increasingly seeking out niche areas of expertise. Buttons, a collector's guide, offered comprehensive information about button types, materials, and historical context, further solidifying the role of printed material in shaping collecting practices. The history of buttons is intertwined with shifts in fashion and clothing construction. Initially functional fasteners, their role evolved alongside changes in garment design. Early garments were secured using pins, brooches, or ties. However, as tailoring techniques advanced during the Renaissance, more elaborate closures became desirable. The development of button-down styles, particularly in men's doublets and women's gowns, created a demand for more secure and decorative fastening solutions. This spurred innovation in button manufacturing, moving beyond simple wooden or bone toggles to include materials like pewter, brass, and later precious metals. The 18th century witnessed an explosion of button styles reflecting the opulence of aristocratic dress. Intricate designs became commonplace, incorporating elaborate carvings, enamel work, and applied ornamentation. These buttons were no longer merely functional. They served as status symbols, signaling wealth and refinement through their materials and craftsmanship. The rise of mass production in the 19th century made buttons more accessible to a broader population, leading to diversification in styles and affordability. While high-end fashion continued to utilize luxurious materials like pearl, jet, and horn, everyday clothing incorporated simpler designs manufactured from base metals or molded plastics. This democratization of button design mirrored wider societal shifts towards greater inclusivity in fashion trends. The Berg Fashion Library database highlights the breadth of resources available for understanding these historical changes, including detailed examinations of dress and fashion across different eras. The Berg Fashion Library database provides access to resources detailing these shifts, revealing how button design reflected broader economic and social changes. While mass production lowered costs, specialized collections continued to emerge, catering to niche markets and preserving traditional craftsmanship. For example, catalogues from firms like James Grove and Sons in Halesowen, England, documented a wide range of buttons available for purchase, illustrating the breadth of styles offered to manufacturers and consumers alike. Similarly, publications such as All About Buttons by Jane Ford Adams provided detailed descriptions and illustrations, serving as both reference guides for collectors and records of button production trends. The National Button Society archives and other collections, as noted in the bibliography compiled by Later Hendricks, hold further documentation of these developments, including catalogues, personal papers, and examples of buttons themselves. These resources allow researchers to trace the evolution of button design from simple fasteners to complex decorative elements, reflecting changing tastes and manufacturing capabilities across different eras. The catalogues from firms like James Grove and Sons in Halesowen, England, documented a wide range of buttons available for purchase, illustrating the breadth of styles offered to manufacturers and consumers alike. Similarly, publications such as All About Buttons by Jane Ford Adams provided detailed descriptions and illustrations, serving as both reference guides for collectors and records of button production trends. The Vogue archive, accessible through databases like EBSCOhost, reveals how buttons were featured in fashion photography and advertising throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries, demonstrating their evolving role in shaping consumer desires and aesthetic ideals. These resources allow researchers to trace the evolution of button design from simple fasteners to complex decorative elements, reflecting changing tastes and manufacturing capabilities across different eras. The emergence of buttons as decorative elements spurred a complex exchange of techniques across cultures. While early button production relied on localized craftsmanship, increasing demand for ornamentation and fasteners fostered interactions between artisans in different regions. European metalworking traditions influenced designs adopted by craftspeople in Asia, while Eastern motifs found their way onto Western buttons. Button Creations 1983 Catalogue, 1001 Buttons, and Other Related Items exemplifies this blending of styles and origins, showcasing a diverse array of button types that reflect cross-cultural influences. The movement of individuals, traders, travelers, and artisans played a crucial role in disseminating these techniques. As trade routes expanded, so did the opportunities for cultural exchange. Artisans often learned from one another, adapting existing methods to incorporate new aesthetics or materials. Jane Ford Adams and Lillian Smith Albert's 1965 catalogue. A descriptive catalogue of pictorial buttons worn on work clothing illustrates this phenomenon through its documentation of buttons bearing imagery reflecting various cultural influences. The adoption of specific button-making tools and processes also contributed to the spread of knowledge. Techniques initially developed in one region could be replicated elsewhere, leading to a gradual homogenization of production methods while simultaneously preserving regional variations. Accounts suggest that Chinese button-making practices, particularly those involving intricate metalwork and enamel decoration, influenced European designs during periods of increased trade between East Asia and Europe. Similarly, Japanese techniques for creating lacquer buttons were adopted by some Western artisans seeking novel finishes and decorative effects. The precise mechanisms of this transmission remain complex to trace due to the often informal nature of artisan-to-artisan knowledge sharing, but surviving button collections frequently reveal hybrid styles indicative of such interactions. Button Creations 1983 catalogue provides visual evidence of these blended influences, displaying buttons that combine Eastern motifs with Western construction methods. The exchange wasn't limited to aesthetics. Improvements in button-making tools also crossed borders. While the earliest methods relied on hand tools and simple molds, the introduction of more sophisticated machinery from one region could spur innovation elsewhere, albeit often adapted to local resources and skill sets. These adaptations frequently involved modifying molds to accommodate local clay types or metal alloys, resulting in variations on established designs. For instance, while European button makers favored pewter and brass for their durability and aesthetic qualities, artisans in regions with limited access to these materials often substituted iron or copper, leading to buttons of a different color and texture. Accounts suggest that advancements in die casting techniques originating in Germany found their way to England and America, though the specifics of transmission remain difficult to ascertain due to the decentralized nature of early button production. The button-making industry today faces a confluence of challenges that threaten its traditional practices and demand innovative solutions for continued viability. One significant pressure stems from the widespread adoption of synthetic fasteners, which offer lower production costs and often perceived greater convenience compared to handcrafted buttons. These alternatives have eroded market share, particularly in mass-produced clothing where affordability is paramount. Simultaneously, growing environmental awareness has placed increased scrutiny on button manufacturing processes. Traditional methods frequently involve resource-intensive practices and potentially harmful chemicals, prompting calls for more sustainable approaches across the entire supply chain. The industry also contends with a shifting consumer landscape. While there remains a demand for high-quality, artisanal buttons, particularly within niche markets like bespoke tailoring and historical reenactment, the broader market increasingly prioritizes inexpensive, readily available options. This necessitates a dual strategy, catering to specialized clientele through premium products while simultaneously exploring avenues for more environmentally responsible and cost-effective production techniques. These pressures are compounded by a lack of readily available training and apprenticeship opportunities for aspiring button makers, leading to a decline in traditional skills and knowledge transfer across generations. While some artisans maintain workshops and offer classes, these initiatives often struggle with limited resources and reach. Furthermore, the complexity of modern supply chains presents challenges in sourcing raw materials sustainably and ethically. Many buttons rely on metals like brass and alloys, whose production can have significant environmental impacts if not managed responsibly. The industry's reliance on globalized trade networks also exposes it to fluctuations in material costs and disruptions in logistics, impacting both profitability and the ability to maintain consistent product quality. To navigate these hurdles, several strategies are being explored. Some manufacturers are investing in research and development to create buttons from recycled materials or bio-based alternatives like plant fibers. Others are focusing on streamlining production processes to minimize waste and energy consumption. A renewed emphasis on traceability within supply chains aims to ensure responsible sourcing practices and promote fair labor standards. These efforts are often hampered by the fragmented nature of the industry itself, with numerous small workshops and independent artisans operating largely outside formal networks for collaboration or knowledge sharing. The absence of comprehensive data on button production volumes and material flows further complicates assessments of environmental impact and opportunities for improvement. While some larger manufacturers have begun to adopt more sustainable practices, such as implementing closed-loop recycling systems for metal scrap, these initiatives remain limited in scope. A significant challenge lies in the perception among many consumers that buttons are a commodity item with little intrinsic value, which discourages willingness to pay a premium for sustainably produced or ethically sourced options. This reinforces the pressure on manufacturers to prioritize cost reduction over environmental considerations. The Ohio State University Library's button bibliography indicates several publications cataloging button collections and manufacturing processes from earlier eras, suggesting an interest in preservation of historical techniques that could inform modern sustainable practices. The Ohio State University Library's button bibliography reveals a consistent interest in documenting and cataloging buttons throughout the 20th century, extending beyond simple collections to include detailed descriptions of manufacturing processes. This focus on documentation suggests an underlying recognition of the button's significance, not just as a fastener, but as a cultural artifact reflecting technological innovation and societal trends. While early catalogs like Button Creations, 1001 Buttons, 1983, primarily served commercial purposes, others, such as Jane Ford Adams, a descriptive catalog of pictorial buttons worn on work clothing, demonstrated an emerging scholarly interest in the button's historical context. The evolution of fastening technology, documented in Manchester's The Evolution of Fastening Devices, 1938, reveals a lineage stretching back centuries, with buttons representing a significant advancement over earlier methods like pins and ties. The transition from bone and shell to metal and later plastics fundamentally altered button production capabilities and aesthetics. This technological leap spurred innovation not only in materials science but also in manufacturing techniques, from hand molding to mass production, which profoundly impacted the availability and affordability of buttons across various social strata. As Jones' The Button Industry, 1924 details, these changes had considerable economic ramifications, creating specialized industries centered around button manufacture and trade. The increasing sophistication of button manufacturing also spurred innovation beyond mere aesthetics and fastening capabilities. As Jones' The Button Industry, 1924 illustrates, advancements in machinery allowed for greater precision and complexity in design, leading to buttons that served functions beyond simple closure. The development of shank buttons, for example, facilitated attachment to thicker fabrics and garments with more elaborate detailing. This functionality extended into specialized applications. Military uniforms frequently incorporated buttons designed not only for fastening, but also as indicators of rank or unit affiliation, a detail documented in Ripley's Police Forces of Great Britain and Ireland, 1973. Furthermore, the emergence of plastics during the early 20th century revolutionized button production. Materials like celluloid and bakelite offered unprecedented design flexibility, allowing for intricate molded shapes and vibrant colors previously unattainable with traditional materials, while also significantly reducing manufacturing costs. This accessibility broadened the appeal of buttons across diverse social groups, transforming them from luxury items into commonplace components of everyday attire. The National Button Society's archives, as noted in the Ohio State University Library's bibliography, hold numerous examples of these early plastic button designs and catalogs showcasing their widespread adoption. The integration of buttons into increasingly complex systems extended beyond military applications and civilian attire. As demonstrated by Wegener's Photographic Reproductions of Antique Buttons, 1941, early electrical devices sometimes utilized button elements for control, though these were rudimentary compared to later iterations. The development of push-button switches, initially employed in telegraphy and signaling systems, represented a significant step toward incorporating buttons into functional machinery. These early switches, as documented in Manchester's The Evolution of Fastening Devices, 1938, leveraged the simple on-off functionality of button pressure to activate circuits, a principle that would later underpin countless automated processes. The subsequent refinement of these mechanisms, alongside advancements in electrical engineering, paved the way for more sophisticated control interfaces. The early electrical devices that incorporated button elements represented a rudimentary step toward integrating buttons into functional machinery. This nascent connection hinted at a future where buttons transcended their role as mere fasteners, evolving into interactive components within complex systems. While Wegener's Photographic Reproductions of Antique Buttons, 1941, showcased these early applications, the potential remained largely untapped. The subsequent refinement of push-button switches, initially utilized in telegraphy and signaling, as documented by Manchester in The Evolution of Fastening Devices, 1938, laid a foundational principle for more sophisticated control interfaces. Looking ahead, it's clear that the future of buttons will likely involve a delicate balance between honoring tradition and embracing technological innovation. The enduring appeal of antique button collecting, as evidenced by catalogs like Button Creations, 1001 Buttons, 1983, and Albert's listings in the National Button Society publications, demonstrates a continued appreciation for their aesthetic and historical significance. This heritage suggests that handcrafted buttons, particularly those employing traditional techniques and materials, will likely retain value and appeal to collectors and consumers alike. However, alongside this preservation of tradition, new technologies promise to redefine what a button can be. The emergence of sustainable materials, a topic not yet explored in the available documentation, but increasingly relevant in contemporary manufacturing, could lead to buttons crafted from plant-based polymers or recycled content, aligning with growing environmental concerns. This anticipated synergy between heritage and innovation also extends to button design itself. While elaborate, hand-carved buttons, reminiscent of Victorian or Edwardian styles, will likely persist as collector's items, as evidenced by their continued presence in catalogues such as The Colourful World of Buttons, 1973. We might see a rise in modular button systems. These could allow for interchangeable faces and functionalities, blending the aesthetic appeal of traditional designs with the adaptability demanded by evolving technologies. The button industry, documented by Jones in 1924, detailed manufacturing processes that prioritized mass production. Future iterations may incorporate elements of both large-scale fabrication and bespoke craftsmanship to cater to diverse consumer preferences. Furthermore, the exploration of novel materials, a subject largely absent from earlier publications like Wegener's work, promises exciting possibilities. The Button Lover's Book, 1991, hints at this potential, but further development is needed. Materials science advancements could yield buttons that are not only aesthetically pleasing and durable, but also biodegradable or derived from renewable resources, aligning with a growing societal emphasis on sustainability. These modular systems could potentially integrate with wearable technology, allowing buttons to serve as discrete interfaces for controlling devices or transmitting biometric data. A concept only tentatively explored in speculative design circles, but hinting at a future where functionality is seamlessly woven into everyday objects. The Button Lover's Book, 1991, mentions the use of plastic and other synthetic materials alongside traditional options, suggesting an early awareness of material diversification. However, detailed technical specifications remain scarce in earlier publications. Further research may reveal more about the experimentation with these alternative substances during the mid-20th century, potentially uncovering unforeseen challenges or breakthroughs that shaped subsequent design choices. The enduring legacy of buttons extends far beyond their practical function as fasteners. They have served as potent symbols, reflecting social status, artistic innovation, and even political affiliation across cultures and centuries. Early examples crafted from bone, shell, or precious metals were not merely functional. They signaled wealth and rank, adorning the garments of elites, while simpler closures remained commonplace for others. The artistry evident in many antique buttons, the intricate carvings, delicate enamel work, or hand-painted scenes demonstrates a level of craftsmanship that elevates them to miniature works of art. Button catalogues such as 1001 Buttons and other related items, 1983, and the Big Book of Buttons, 1991, showcase this diversity, preserving visual records of these often overlooked objects. These collections reveal a fascinating interplay between practicality and aesthetics. Political campaign buttons, for instance, transformed the simple fastener into a vehicle for propaganda, disseminating messages and rallying support during elections, a tradition documented in Albert's political campaign and commemorative buttons, 1966. Military buttons similarly served as emblems of identity and allegiance, often incorporating regimental crests or national symbols. The Emilio collection of military buttons, housed at the Essex Institute, offers a detailed look at these symbolic markers, illustrating their significance in representing military units and nations. Even seemingly mundane materials like glass and pearl were transformed into objects of beauty, as highlighted by publications such as Schiff's Buttons, 1991, which explores buttons as miniature art forms. The enduring appeal of buttons extends beyond their practical function and aesthetic qualities. They offer a tangible link to past eras, sparking curiosity about the lives and customs of those who wore them. The meticulous records kept by organizations like the National Button Society, a group dedicated to preserving button history and fostering appreciation for these small objects, demonstrate this ongoing interest. Publications such as the Collector's Encyclopedia of Buttons, 1967, and Discovering Old Buttons, 1978, reflect a desire not only to catalog buttons but also to understand their cultural significance, tracing their evolution alongside shifts in fashion, technology, and social norms. The work of researchers like Florence Zachary Ellis Nichols, whose publications such as Button Handbook, 1943, and subsequent supplements attempted to systematize button identification and valuation, further underscores the dedication to preserving this often overlooked aspect of material culture. Even institutions outside Western nations recognize the historical importance of fasteners. For instance, the Republic of Türkiye, Ministry of Culture and Tourism, highlights ancient sites like Aphrodisias, which reveal evidence of early fastening devices alongside other artifacts from antiquity. These efforts ensure that buttons continue to be studied and appreciated as miniature reflections of broader historical trends. The ongoing efforts to document and preserve button histories reflect a broader appreciation for material culture's ability to illuminate past lives. For instance, the Republic of Türkiye Ministry of Culture and Tourism highlights ancient sites like Aphrodisias, where archaeological finds include early fastening devices alongside other artifacts from antiquity, demonstrating an awareness of these objects' historical significance within a wider cultural context. The enduring appeal of buttons lies not merely in their practical function as fasteners, but also in their capacity to reflect evolving cultural values and technological advancements across time. From ancient civilizations employing rudimentary fastening devices to the sophisticated manufacturing processes of today, the button's journey mirrors broader shifts in human history. The earliest examples, crafted from natural materials like bone or shell, served a basic need to secure garments, but also hinted at early artistic expression through their shapes and decorative elements. As societies developed, so too did buttons, transitioning from simple closures to intricate symbols of status and identity. The 19th century witnessed an explosion in button production, fueled by industrialization and the rise of mass consumerism. New materials like brass, steel, and celluloid enabled increasingly elaborate designs and vibrant colors, transforming buttons into miniature works of art. This era also saw the emergence of specialized button industries, catering to diverse markets from military uniforms to high fashion. The proliferation of catalogs documenting these developments, such as Button Creations 1983 and The Magic Land of Kate Greenway 1968, underscores the significance placed on buttons within this period. These publications not only showcased available designs but also contributed to a growing culture of collecting and appreciation for these small objects. Even institutions outside Western nations recognize the historical importance of fasteners. For instance, the Republic of Türkiye Ministry of Culture and Tourism highlights ancient sites like Aphrodisias, which reveal evidence of early fastening devices alongside other artifacts from antiquity. These catalogues offer a glimpse into not only the aesthetic preferences of the time, but also the evolving roles buttons played in expressing identity and belonging. The colorful world of buttons, for example, highlights the vibrancy and artistry achievable through new manufacturing techniques, while Albert's work on Confederate buttons underscores their significance as symbols of political allegiance during a period of national division. Even publications like Wegener's photographic reproductions demonstrate an appreciation for the historical value embedded within these small objects. The sheer volume of such documentation, extending to specialized areas like military insignia and commemorative pieces, testifies to the widespread fascination with buttons that characterized the 19th and 20th centuries. This interest has continued into the present day, as evidenced by contemporary collecting guides such as Osborne's About Buttons, 1994, and Perry's exploration of peasant silver buttons, which seek to preserve and interpret this tangible history for new generations. These catalogues and guides reflect a broader shift toward appreciating buttons not merely as functional fasteners, but as miniature works of art, historical documents, and tangible links to the past. The proliferation of specialized publications, those focusing on military insignia, political campaigns, or regional styles like Dorset's silver buttons, highlights the increasing depth of interest within collecting communities. This dedication to preservation and documentation ensures that future generations will have access to these small but significant artifacts, allowing them to continue piecing together a more complete understanding of human history and cultural expression.